Hey guys, tonight we will step through the secret door of Richmond Palace in 1603, where greatness and horror merged. Forget the Queen Elizabeth I that history praises, the invincible monarch, the icon of eternal purity and strength. We are going to explore a different Elizabeth, a woman trapped in a Gothic nightmare of her own making. The public image was of ageless beauty, but the hidden truth is a story of accumulated poison, decaying flesh, and mental disintegration. She voluntarily applied a deadly white lead mask to her face daily, believing it would preserve her youth. Yet it was the very substance that ate away at her skin, permeated her blood and brain, pushing her into a state of paranoia and madness in her final years. We will witness this terrifying collapse through the eyes of the silent attendants, those who saw weeping, festering sores beneath the thick layer of powder, who witnessed her black, rotting teeth, and heard the frantic screams in the night of a queen tormented by pain and fear. This is the ultimate horrifying price of absolute vanity, transforming a living person into something akin to a lavishly painted walking corpse. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I am very curious. Where in the world are you right now, and what time is it on your clock? Please share with me. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Behind the golden aura of the greatest Queen of England, behind the triumph over the Spanish Armada and the so-called Golden Age, lies a very different Elizabeth. Not Elizabeth the Queen, but Elizabeth the woman, made of flesh and bone, slowly betrayed by the body she once believed belonged to a divine purpose. It is the early 17th century. Within the cold stone walls of Richmond Palace, walls that once echoed with music and courtly laughter voices now dwindle to whispers. Courtiers no longer dare to meet her eye. They bow lower than ever, worry threading through every gesture, every carefully measured step. There she sits, crowned and resplendent in silk and jewels, the embodiment of royal myth. And yet, beneath the weight of her finery, a silent horror unfolds. She still wears the crown. She still wears the lace and velvet robes layered in ceremonial symbolism. She still wears the title, the Virgin Queen, untouched, eternal, anointed by God. But beneath each fold of fabric, beneath the stiff collars and gilded embroidery, her body is slowly rotting, inch by inch, like a cursed relic. Her skin, once luminous in youthful portraits, now hides under a mask of lead and artifice. Those official portraits showing flawless skin, serene eyes, immortal beauty, are lies. Necessary lies. Lies that protected the nation. Lies that reassured her subjects. Lies that even Elizabeth must sometimes have wished were true, for the truth remained shuttered behind locked doors. To see her in private, stripped of the performance, was to witness the collapse of flesh. The precious white mask of her public face hid layers of decay. Her skin beneath was no longer smooth. It was eaten away by her own rituals. Layer by layer, the makeup she trusted turned predator. It did not simply sit atop her skin, it seeped in, poisoned, betrayed. Those few who breached her circle, physicians, attendants sworn to silence, women who helped her dress carried with them visions they could never forget. They saw sores that would not heal. They saw skins sloughing off like wet parchment. They saw a queen who, in her desperation to remain ageless, was being consumed by a chemical curse she could neither flee nor defy. And perhaps the cruelest irony of all, she knew that every morning she painted not just her face but her fate. For this was not ordinary aging. It was not the graceful arc of time, soft and surrendering. It was slow poisoning, begun decades earlier through vanity, continued under the pressure of politics, and now concluding in creeping horror. Elizabeth was not naive. She was brilliant, shrewd enough to survive rebellion, assassination plots, religious upheaval, betrayal, and war. She had outmaneuvered monarchs and ministers alike, wielding language and image with surgical precision. But the final battle, the one she could never win, was fought within her own skin. She had claimed her body for England. She had offered her womanhood as sacrifice to a crown and a people, and the kingdom accepted. The price was clear. Her body must not falter. Her beauty must remain untouched. Her image must be preserved not just for pride, but for national unity. For to show age was to show weakness. To reveal decay was to invite predators. Every sovereign was vulnerable, but a woman monarch, unmarried, without an heir, reigning through myth and charisma rather than brute lineage, she needed to stay perfect. So, she let the poison continue. Each day she rose, her attendants preparing her like a saint's relic. They washed the wounds, they dusted the corruption, they sealed surface fractures with pigment, oils and paste. And when the mirror offered a glimpse of the truth underneath, she turned away, because to stop now would be to reveal that the myth of eternal Elizabeth was just that, a myth. Elizabeth once defeated the mightiest empire in Europe. She ruled a kingdom torn apart by religious violence and forged it into a cultural powerhouse. Yet in the silence of her private chambers, she battled the one enemy that neither crown nor sword could vanquish: mortality. She could not imprison it. She could not execute it. She could not bargain with it. Death came softly, disguised as a cosmetic brush, a whispered reassurance, a promise of eternal youth. Behind the golden age is a woman sitting alone on her throne, wrapped in silk, surrounded by perfumed air that can no longer mask the smell of her own body breaking down. And even then, especially then, she did what she always did. She endured. To understand the tragedy of Elizabeth's final years, one must first understand the beauty culture of Tudor England and the immense pressure placed upon royal women to possess not only political legitimacy, but also physical perfection. Beauty was not a private matter, it was political currency. A youthful face, pale radiant skin, and serene composure were more than aesthetic ideals. They were social proofs of divine favour and fitness to rule. For Elizabeth, this connection between appearance and authority was cemented from the moment she declared herself the Virgin Queen, sovereign not just over a realm, but over her own body. A body she consecrated as belonging to England alone, untouched by marriage or male possession. Eternal beauty was not simply a preference. It was policy. To grow old, visibly and undeniably, was to invite doubt. Doubt about strength, doubt about legitimacy, doubt about whether God's favour had moved elsewhere. In such a setting, every wrinkle became a threat, every blemish a liability. Aging was not only a natural process, it was a silent political crisis. And like every crisis Elizabeth had weathered before, she responded not with surrender but with strategy. That strategy took the form of cosmetics, not as decoration, but as armour. At the heart of this ritual was ceruse, known also as Venetian ceruse, or the spirit of Saturn. This was no ordinary powder. It was a thick, milky paste, made primarily from white lead mixed with vinegar, creating the porcelain-like complexion that aristocratic women coveted. Applied carefully, it erased all imperfections, granting the wearer the ethereal pallor associated with nobility and purity. White skin, in that era, signaled freedom from labour, from sun, from the ordinary world. It signaled privilege and God's favour. Yet the glamour was an illusion. Beneath the smooth white sheen, something irreversible was happening. Lead, even in small quantities, is a cumulative poison. It slips silently through the pores with each application, travels through the bloodstream, and lodges in the bones and organs. The early signs are innocuous enough: headaches, irritability, digestive discomfort, symptoms that would be easily dismissed. Over months and years they sharpen into lethargy, weak muscles, cognitive decline, mood swings, even organ damage. Worst of all, lead causes the very condition it promises to prevent: premature aging. The skin, once smoothed by the creamy paste, is gradually dried, thinned, stripped of resilience. Fine lines appear sooner. A grey pallor replaces the desired whiteness. Patches of dermatitis and sores develop, and so the response must be more ceruse, more paste, thicker coverage. A cycle forms, each layer feeding the next, like a serpent eating its own tail. By the time Elizabeth entered her 30s, around the year 1565, contemporaries praised her natural beauty, her fine features, her bright eyes, her fair skin. Yet, as she crossed into her 40s and 50s, the balance shifted. What had been enhancement became dependency. The mirror did not lie, but it offered no mercy. She could either cease and reveal what time and lead had done, or proceed deeper into the mask that kept the world convinced. So she continued. She had to, And with each morning the transformation grew more intricate, more painstaking. One of her ladies-in-waiting would begin by washing her face, delicately removing the previous day's mixture, though not all could be removed without tearing delicate skin. A fresh layer of ceruse would then be applied, blended with meticulous care. Hours passed this way, and through them all, Elizabeth sat silent, regal, enduring. Because to flinch would be to admit the pain. To question would be to crack the illusion. She had never been permitted doubt, not on the battlefield of politics, and now, not in the quiet chamber of her own reflection. The tragedy, of course, is that this was not vanity alone. It was survival. It was sovereignty forged on skin. To remain beloved, to remain obeyed, she needed to remain unchanged. Even as her body betrayed her, even as the poison crawled deeper, there was no choice. That was the cost of the myth she had built. That was the duty beneath the crown. Each morning she rose to wage that silent war, the brush her weapon, the mirror her enemy. And somewhere, beneath the immaculate surface, the truth waited tired, invisible, and already fading. When the lead began to destroy her skin, Elizabeth could not stop. She had to apply more. At first, the damage was subtle. A few small rashes, a slight roughness that could be concealed with an extra dab. But as the years marched on, the veneer of porcelain began to crack. The skin beneath, once smooth as alabaster, started to flake, itch, and break open. Ceruse, that white lead paste she'd once trusted to perfect her features, did not remain on the surface. It seeped in, layer after layer, quietly transforming her skin into something closer to dead earth than living tissue. Red welts rose like warning signs. Blisters formed. Patches of raw skin wept under the weight of repeated applications. To hide such wounds, Elizabeth was forced to lay down thicker and thicker coats of her poison. One blemish required a smear of paste, then two, then three. And with each attempt to cover, she only exacerbated the damage. What had begun as ordinary adornment slowly evolved into the wearing of a mask. Not a metaphorical one, a literal one of lead and vinegar pressed to her face every morning, sealing in decay, suppressing truth beneath layers of toxic white. The ritual was sacred, endless, and secret above all. It could only be conducted in the seclusion of her private chambers, under locked doors and drawn tapestries. Only a handful of ladies-in-waiting, sworn to silence, bound by duty and fear, were permitted to assist. Together, they enacted a kind of grotesque liturgy. Wash the face gently, blot away the oozing wounds, apply the salve. Then, when the skin was dry, or at least no longer dripping layer on the fresh coat of ceruse, imagine it. Every morning, the veil of night lifted, only to reveal a face that had suffered more damage. Modern medical researchers suggest she might have developed chronic contact dermatitis, ulcerations, and even precancerous skin changes due to the constant exposure to heavy metals and abrasives. Each removal of the previous day's mask would have been like sanding a wound. The skin's natural defenses were stripped away, leaving raw patches, swollen ridges, and weeping sores beneath the surface. The cosmetics promised perfection. They delivered corrosion. And yet, even this was not enough. To restore colour to her now ghostly complexion, Elizabeth turned to vermilion, a vivid red pigment made from mercury sulfide, known today as a neurotoxin. She would stain her lips, tint her cheeks, creating the illusion of vitality over the stillness of damaged skin. But mercury, unlike lead, travels quickly to the nervous system. It disrupts emotions. It disrupts memory. It can unsettle sleep, weaken the limbs, and unhinge the thoughts. The phrase, mad as a hatter, born from another profession exposed to mercury, could just as easily have applied to Elizabeth as the years wore on. Her eyes, too, needed transformation. Not even the windows to her soul were spared from the pursuit of fabricated youth. To enlarge her pupils and create a soft, doe-like gaze, her attendants administered belladonna, a substance derived from deadly nightshade. A beautiful name, a beautiful effect. But belladonna contains atropine, a powerful compound that, in even modest doses, blurs vision, increases heart rate, and invites hallucinations. Some observers noted how Elizabeth's eyes grew red and unfocused in her later years, how she struggled to read even large script. It was not just age, it was self-inflicted blindness, one drop at a time. By dawn each morning, Elizabeth was not simply painted. She was reconstructed, layer by layer, brushstroke by brushstroke. Under the cover of ritual and luxury, beneath the gold-draped ceiling and perfumed air, she was becoming a kind of living experiment. A queen in a body that each day grew less human, more poisoned, and yet more idolized for its visual perfection. Here, in the private stillness of her chambers, she traded another day of life for another day of image. She knew what it cost. She saw how the lead ate at her face, how the mercury twisted her thoughts. And yet every morning she gave the order, again. Because in the kingdom she had built, where myth was truth and beauty was power, to stop was not an option. To stop was to crumble. And so, Elizabeth I, Queen of England, painted her body into ruin one sunrise at a time and bore it in silence. If the skin was a horror story written in daylight, then the teeth were a nightmare whispered only in darkness. In the Tudor world of opulence and spectacle, diet was a status symbol, and nothing marked privilege like sugar. It was expensive, rare, and cherished, and Elizabeth loved it. She was known for her sweet tooth, consuming sugared fruits, candied peels, marzipan, spiced cakes, and elaborate desserts made for court banquets. Sugar flowed into her mouth as easily as praise flowed from foreign ambassadors. But what seems harmless now was then a slow, corroding poison, not toxic in itself, but fatal in silence. For in Elizabeth's time, dental hygiene simply did not exist. No toothbrushes, no dental floss, not even a basic concept of preventing decay. The Queen, like all of noble birth, lived in a world where the rich rotted from the inside first and smiled through it until they no longer could. I.e., sugar clung to teeth, formed plaque, and fed bacteria, which in turn produced acid. Acid bored through enamel and crept into dentin. By the time Elizabeth reached middle age around the year 1575, her once light, even teeth had begun to yellow, shift, and fall away. A German ambassador who visited in 1597 tried to phrase it politely, "Her teeth are black, many are missing." But other, more private accounts would not soften the truth. Her teeth were not merely discoloured, they were rotting, cracked to the root. Some were reduced to mere blackened stumps. Others had cavities so deep that the bone beneath showed. The charming smile that once dazzled the court had disappeared, replaced by lips that barely parted, even in laughter. She learned to smile with her mouth closed, learned to turn her head just slightly when laughing. A monarch in all her power, hiding her mouth like a disgraced child. And then came the pain. Dental abscesses are among the most acute forms of suffering the human body can endure. Modern medicine has likened the pain to being stabbed repeatedly inside the jaw. For Elizabeth, this was not a single event but a recurring plague. Over and over, throughout her final decade, she was struck by episodes of swelling, fever, and pain that left her unable to speak, eat, or appear in public. Those around her whispered of the Queen's indisposition, recorded in royal diaries and correspondence as vague illness. But the truth was far more visceral. She was rotting from the mouth inward. There was no anesthesia, no gentle dentistry. Tooth extraction was the only treatment, and it was barbaric. The royal barber surgeon would arrive with crude iron forceps. Several attendants would pin the Queen to her chair while he wrenched the tooth free if it came free. Often it shattered, leaving shards embedded in the gum. Some accounts even describe pieces of jawbone being pulled out along with the root. The risk of infection afterward was enormous. Death by dental infection was not uncommon. No wonder Elizabeth feared the chair more than the battlefield. She delayed every extraction, often for years, enduring agony rather than surrendering to the tools that waited in her chamber. And yet, even here, her determination forced its way through. In the year 1578, when it became clear that a tooth had to be pulled, she simply refused. No begging, no pleading moved her. It took a strange act of loyalty to change her mind. John Aylmer, Bishop of London, volunteered to have one of his healthy teeth pulled first to prove to the Queen that she would survive the ordeal. Only then did she consent. Even then, her screams echoed through the palace corridors, heard by ladies in waiting 2 rooms away. She never forgot it. The trauma burned itself into memory. She avoided the surgeon's tools with even greater resolve afterward. As the teeth fell out one by one, her speech changed. The gaps created a whistling when she spoke certain letters. A slight lisp developed. Loyal ministers pretended they did not notice. Foreign ambassadors, if they were wise, did the same. But she noticed. Always. And as her cheeks began to sink inward where teeth and bone had once shaped her face, the Queen turned to yet another desperate illusion. Before public appearances, her ladies would stuff small balls of cloth into her cheeks, pressing them between gum and skin. They were meant to mimic full, youthful cheeks to hide the hollows of decay. She was forced to hold them in place with her tongue. It made eating nearly impossible, speaking uncomfortable. But appearance was everything, and so she bore it. In a reign defined by theatre, she played her role until the end. Even as her body crumbled in the shadows, even as every smile became a silent act of pain, the infections in Elizabeth's mouth did not simply remain a local torment, they began a silent war against her entire body. By the time she was well into her 60s and 70s, historical records describe sudden attacks of fever, chills, confusion, and swelling. These were carefully noted in royal documents as moments when the Queen was indisposed, yet no explanation was ever offered. Modern medical analysis suggests the terrifying truth. Elizabeth likely suffered multiple episodes of septicemia, or blood poisoning, originating from untreated dental abscesses. Picture it. Each rotting tooth, each pocket of pus, was a secret factory of bacteria. Once these pathogens entered the bloodstream, they traveled swiftly, invading organs, triggering inflammation, overwhelming an immune system already battered by age and poison. Each episode would begin with a sudden fever, her body burning, yet trembling with chills. Her jaw would swell grotesquely. Her skin, already fragile, pale beneath layers of ceruse, flushed a deep, infected red. Her eyes, normally bright with controlled intelligence, grew bloodshot and restless. Inside her mouth, pus would gather and leak, seeping from inflamed gums, staining her compressed lace collars and embroidered gowns with yellowish streaks no perfume could fully disguise. The stench, too, became inescapable. Even with censers burning, even with scented oils applied by trembling servants, the smells of decay and infection permeated her private chambers. Accounts from those unfortunate enough to be near her during these episodes describe an odour, both sweet and rotten, the unmistakable smell of a body decomposing while still alive. And yet, her teeth were only one battlefield. Her skin, destroyed by decades of lead-based cosmetics, was its own site of continual infection. Every removal of ceruse tore at her dermis, leaving raw, exposed skin vulnerable to bacteria. Chronic ulcers, raised cankers, and lesions that oozed clear or yellow fluid appeared again and again. They were not superficial complaints, but signs of deep dermatological deterioration, possibly linked to both toxic exposure and persistent bacterial invasion. These sores appeared most often on her face and hands, the two most visible parts of her body, and the two parts that bore the most weight of performance. Each morning, her attendants would cleanse the wounds, apply ointments, few of which helped more than they burned, and then reapply the layers of ceruse and vermilion that sealed the infection beneath a chemical crust. Over time, these cycles only worsened her condition, slowly reducing her epidermis to something like parchment, thin, brittle, prone to tearing. To touch her face would have been to risk drawing blood. Then there were the illnesses that no one dared discuss, the women's ailments that plagued her for decades. Court correspondence mentions disturbances of the womb, bouts of severe abdominal pain, irregular bleeding. In an age where gynecological medicine was nearly non-existent, these symptoms could have indicated endometriosis, ovarian cysts, or even cervical cancer. But no diagnosis was ever spoken aloud. In Elizabeth's world, such suffering was hidden beneath corsets and ceremony. It was endured, quietly, always. Altogether, her body became a map of chronic inflammation. Each wound fed the next. Each infection weakened her further. Her physicians offered what little they could: herbal poultices, bloodletting, prayers. Sometimes she was bled until faint. Sometimes she drank decoctions that tasted of metal and soil. Each treatment, well-intended or not, only drained what strength she had left. She was being undone from the inside out. But this is where the story turns from body to will, because even as she waited for her blood to cool between fits of fever, even as her jaw swelled so badly she struggled to speak, even as sores wept beneath white lead masks, Elizabeth still ruled. She still signed documents, still received ambassadors, still held court when needed. Those who stood before her in Richmond Palace or Whitehall might have noticed a tremor in her hand or a forced stillness in her jaw. But then she would speak a measured word, a sharp command, and the room would remember. This was Queen Elizabeth, sovereign of England for 44 years, the ruler who survived plots, rebellion, and empire. And she stood, every time, even as her body collapsed. Inside she had become, as one writer later described, a slowly decomposing corpse in state. But externally she remained tall, alert, powerful, even if she had to be held upright by the stiff boning of her gown or propped by cushions beneath her throne. It is one of the most haunting truths of her story, that she kept the performance alive, even as life itself receded. Hungrily, the infections gnawed at her bones. Patiently, the poisons unmade her nerves. And relentlessly, each morning, she let them paint over her decay and walked out to reign once more. The unraveling of Elizabeth's body was horrifying, but what happened to her mind was something even more tragic. For decades, she had outwitted rivals, charmed kingdoms, and stood unshaken in the storm of European politics. Her mind was her greatest weapon. And yet, in her final decade, her 60s and 70s, that mind began to crumble, not from age alone, but from poison. Lead and mercury, absorbed every day through her cosmetics, are not just skin-deep toxins. They cross the blood-brain barrier. They infiltrate synapses. They wreak havoc on thought itself. Modern neurology tells us that chronic lead exposure causes mood changes, cognitive decline, depression, irritability. Mercury, especially in the form of mercury sulfide found in vermilion, causes tremors, emotional volatility, and hallucinations. Elizabeth was ingesting both daily for over 3 decades. The consequences were inevitable. Historical records reveal the earliest cracks in her psyche, not through medical notes, those were vague and coded, but through observation. Court diaries, ambassadors' letters, private reports whispered between diplomats. Around the year 1598, when Elizabeth was 65, people noticed something unsettling. She was obsessed with mirrors, yet increasingly terrified of them. She would demand a mirror, then recoil from it, stare deeply, then scream for it to be taken away. Sometimes she shouted at her own reflection. Other times, she fell into paralyzing silence, staring as if she saw something no one else could. Finally, she ordered every mirror removed from her private quarters. The sight of her real face had become intolerable, not just distasteful, unbearable. From there, the paranoia bloomed. Foreign dignitaries reported that she refused food if she hadn't watched the taster eat from every platter twice. She accused longtime servants of plotting against her. She kept daggers tucked into cushions and insisted on sleeping with a sword near her bed. In the quiet hours of night, her scream could pierce the walls of Richmond Palace. She was haunted by visions of assassins, of betrayal, of death creeping down the corridor. But the enemy was already inside her, running through her veins. Mercury poisoning causes tremors, memory loss, and emotional instability. Lead poisoning, especially sustained over decades, leads to confusion, depression, delusions. Together, they become a neurological storm. It's no surprise that Elizabeth's symptoms intensified. She began to forget names, first courtiers, then ladies-in-waiting who had served her for decades. There were moments when she read a state paper mid-sentence and forgot what she was reading. Ambassadors reported audiences where she drifted off, gazing at some empty space beyond the room. They left bewildered not by her sharpness, as generations before them had, but by her absence. Worse still were the wild outbursts. In her youth, Elizabeth was famous for her controlled fury. Cold, sharp, effective. But now her anger erupted without warning, like lightning over a burning field. She threw objects at servants. She slapped courtiers across the face. Once, she tore at her own hair, screaming that she was being betrayed, that her enemies were close. Hours later, she would weep and beg forgiveness without remembering exactly what she had done. This wasn't simply aging. This was chronic encephalopathy, the brain inflamed and degraded by poison. And it hollowed her from within. Imagine the suffering for a woman who once spoke 5 languages, who delivered speeches that brought armies to heel, who navigated the crushing weight of monarchy with a mind like a blade. And then imagine watching that blade rust, corrode, and collapse. Elizabeth wasn't merely losing her beauty. She was losing herself. The forgotten names, the scattered thoughts, the broken sleep, the creeping terror in her own chambers. These were the final acts of a quiet warfare happening inside her skull. All while she continued to rule. All while she continued to wear the crown. Her face may have been a mask, but her mind, once a fortress, was being undone, one poisoned day at a time. If her body was a dying tree, then her mind was the roots, rotting in silence until the branches above began to wither. Perhaps the cruelest part of this story is not how Elizabeth looked at the end, but how much of herself she knew she was losing. And yet she fought to keep ruling. She stood in councils, signed treaties, dictated proclamations. Even as the poison in her face became the poison in her thoughts. Even as her keenest weapon, the intellect that built an empire, slipped, grain by grain, into the quiet night. As the body corroded and the mind frayed, Elizabeth retreated not to safety, but into a gilded cell of her own making. Richmond Palace, once alive with music, intrigue, and flame-lit splendor, slowly transformed into a fortress of isolation. The queen who once ruled from the very center of a glittering court, laughing, arguing, dancing, commanding, began to withdraw into rooms where no one saw her unless invited, and where even invited eyes were carefully denied the chance to see too clearly. This was no ordinary privacy. It was self-erasure, measured and intentional. Old Rye, gone were the public feasts where ambassadors from France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire marveled at her wit. Gone were the late-night mask dances where she, already over 40, twirled beside men half her age, proving she was still vital, still irresistible, still queen. Now, when Elizabeth appeared in public at all, it was for brief, pre-scripted ceremonies and under strict conditions. The lighting must be low candle-lit or filtered through drapery. Guests must keep their distance. Ladies-in-waiting must position themselves strategically to obscure angles where her disfigurement was most visible. The queen moved slowly, deliberately, every gesture calculated to mask weakness. Even in triumph, there was tension. Her presence was still powerful, but it was a performance held together by will and lace. Inside her private chambers, the truth was unbearable. Letters and diaries from the handful of women who attended her morning toilette reveal the horror beneath silence. Every morning the ritual began. Remove the previous day's ceruse carefully, because the skin beneath often came off with it. Clean the patches of exposed flesh. Apply salves, herbal ointments, sometimes mixed with powdered pearls or rosewater, none of which stopped the infections. Then the mask must be rebuilt. They wrote of how she winced as they applied new layers over wounds not yet closed. How she sometimes wept quietly, not from vanity alone but from pain. One attendant wrote, "We dressed Her Majesty as if preparing a body for burial, though she drew breath still." Once the makeup was complete, once the crown and ruff were reattached, they allowed others to enter, but only briefly, only from the right angle. And never, under any circumstances, without layers between her and the truth. The tragedy wasn't simply that Elizabeth was decaying. It was that she could not stop performing while she decayed. Imagine this. A woman in her 70s, bones aching, teeth gone, mind flickering like a candle, sitting alone on the royal throne in an empty chamber. No ministers present, no audience. Just her and the symbols of power. The robes, the orb, the scepter, and above all, the crown. Historians believe she did this often in her final years, entering the vast and echoing presence chamber, dressed in full regalia, and sitting there for hours. Sometimes in silence, sometimes whispering speeches she once delivered with fire, sometimes stroking the jewels on her glove as if to reassure herself, "I am still Elizabeth." It was not vanity anymore. It was survival of identity. For Elizabeth, the performance was the self. She had spent 44 years reigning on image as much as law, image as shield, image as weapon. The Virgin Queen was not merely a title. It was a constructed mythology that held England together. To reveal her true face-rotting skin, missing teeth, fevered eyes would have meant admitting that myth was a lie, that she was only human, that she was dying, and so she retreated into a palace that was no longer a court, but a stage without an audience. A place where every mirror had been removed, every candle adjusted, every servant trained not to flinch. She lived surrounded by people, and yet utterly alone, Trapped in a looping performance, neither her mind nor body could sustain, but one she believed she could never relinquish. In this haunting solitude, we see something deeper than physical decay. We see the psychological cost of power, and a loneliness not of circumstance but of identity. The queen who conquered the Armada was now conquered by her own fear of being seen, not seen as sovereign, but seen as she truly was, human, suffering, and no longer invincible. The golden world she ruled became the velvet-lined prison in which she watched herself slowly fade, line by line, layer by layer, until all that was left was the performance. And even that began to crumble. The most chilling truth about Elizabeth's decline is this: the cure was often worse than the disease. In the Tudor world, medicine was still shackled to medieval superstition. Even the most learned physicians armed with Latin degrees and royal patents were more alchemists than doctors, and their treatments more torture than healing. Elizabeth's suffering was not only prolonged by poison, it was made daily, hourly worse by the very hands tending to her. The framework of Tudor medicine rested on the ancient theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was believed to result from an imbalance among them, and the most popular remedy for excess blood, or almost any ailment, was bloodletting. Elizabeth was bled repeatedly, sometimes with leeches, other times through incisions at the arm or ankle. Her physicians believed they were draining out bad humours. In reality, they were draining her strength. Each session left her paler, weaker, more susceptible to infection. Still, the practice continued. The worse she got, the more blood they took. It was a vicious spiral of misplaced faith. For the ravaged skin on her face and hands, the physicians reached for ointments and pastes that today would be labelled toxic waste. They mixed mercury, arsenic, and antimony with animal fat or ground pearls, expensive alchemical blends designed to restore youth. These remedies might have offered brief cosmetic improvement, but the burning, blistering reactions that followed only worsened her condition. Some of the salves left her flesh red and weeping, some caused infection, none healed. Her dental agony, too, received only primitive attention. To soothe the pain of decaying molars, Elizabeth sometimes used oil of cloves, a mild antiseptic still used for temporary relief. But this offered only fleeting respite. When abscesses swelled and ruptured, sending infection raging through her jaw, the only option was extraction, performed without anesthesia, without sterilization, with iron tools that were as likely to break the teeth as remove them intact. The Queen, held down by trembling attendants, while a barber surgeon twisted metal into her mouth. This was standard care. And then, when pain overwhelmed her beyond any threshold, the line between medicine and mysticism blurred. Elizabeth, ever a woman of intellect, now reached desperately for alchemy, astrology, and magic. Her reputation built over decades on reason and political cunning did not save her from the terror of mortality. The court buzzed with whispers of miracle elixirs. Men with charts claimed celestial alignments could extend life. Alchemists promised powders that transformed age into youth. Wise women offered herbs infused with moonlight and blood. And Elizabeth, though skeptical, tried almost everything. She swallowed tonics said to rejuvenate the flesh made from the blood of young men, according to later historians. She bathed in wine, steeped with mysterious herbs to draw out corruption. Tortured accounts suggest she may even have believed in the medicinal power of human remains, organs, or fat from executed criminals used in salves and tinctures. In an age that feared witchcraft yet believed deeply in sympathetic magic, such remedies were whispered as the last hope. What makes this all the more poignant is that Elizabeth knew better. She had studied philosophy, theology, languages. She could debate theology with bishops. And yet, faced with unrelenting pain, skin rotting, bone aching, mind unraveling, she clung to whatever promise would postpone the inevitable. There is bitter irony here, because one of the only things that might truly have slowed her destruction, the cessation of lead paint and mercury cosmetics, was the one thing she refused to abandon. Her physicians hinted, some pleaded, but the Queen would hear none of it. To her, the white mask was not a choice, it was identity, sovereignty, armor. She could survive bleeding, abscesses, fevers, but to appear in public without her flawless facade? That was death of another kind, a humiliation she would not endure. And so, day after day, her attendants crushed pearls, mixed lead with vinegar, and brushed mercury over decayed lips, knowing what these rituals cost her, but knowing too that she demanded them. Elizabeth's decline was not just biological, it was a tragedy of performance. Every poisoned mask she wore, every chamber she retreated into, every torture disguised as treatment, was all in service to an image she could never allow to die. And in the end, it killed her. In the winter of the year 1603, Queen Elizabeth was 70 years old, an astonishing lifespan for her era. But though she lived longer than most, her body and mind had been dying piece by poison piece for years. The final blow was not inflicted by poison, infection, or political stress, but by the quiet death of her closest friend, Catherine Carey, Countess of Nottingham, in February of that same year. Catherine had been more than a courtier. She was one of the very few who had seen Elizabeth as a person, not a symbol. She had helped dress her. She had watched her cry. She knew the smell of the ointments, the trembling hands beneath the gloves. And now she was gone. The loss shattered what remained of Elizabeth's emotional resilience. She stopped eating. She refused her bed, choosing instead to sit or lie upon cushions on the floor. She would not be moved. For nearly 4 weeks, she sat bowed and silent, wrapped in heavy robes, though she shivered constantly. When attendants pleaded with her to lie down, she replied softly, "If I lay down, I may never rise again." It was as if she could feel the boundary between exhaustion and death hovering just beneath her feet. And then came the moment that had been avoided for decades. Aftermain. One morning, her ladies, desperate to clean her properly and assess her health, found her without her mask of ceruse. They saw the Queen of England as she truly was. Her skin, once depicted as milk white in every state portrait, was now grey, mottled and scarred. Patches of ulcerated lesions still seeped clear fluid. Other areas were cracked and bleeding. Her cheeks, no longer filled with cloth, had collapsed inward. The lack of teeth gave her mouth a sunken, skeletal look. Her breath, fouled by rot and infection, was almost unbearable to inhale. Even her eyes, once sharp and glittering with wit, had grown clouded and unfocused. One attendant wrote, "I saw her and wished I had not. She was not the queen of my youth, but something more like the phantom of her reign, unflew." Her hair, once described as shining red gold in her younger years, was thinned to wisps. Her wig had been removed. Strands clung to her scalp in tangled patches, hanging like dried grass over a withered skull. Elizabeth, a monarch who spent her life perfecting the artifice of power, had finally been stripped of it, and though she did not speak of it directly, her silence said everything. She knew she could not bear the sight of herself without the mask. But even in this ruin, her mind wandered back to the voices of the past. In her final weeks, Elizabeth spoke frequently, but not to the living. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that she called out to her father, Henry VIII, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry. She murmured apologies to her mother, Anne Boleyn, a woman she had never known. She asked questions of her sister, Mary Tudor, the same queen who had once imprisoned her. She whispered to Mary, Queen of Scots, a woman she had signed the death warrant for. Night after night, she mumbled names and sentences no one else could understand. She reached toward empty corners of the room. She sat silent for hours, then burst into ramblings. One phrase returned more than any other. "I cannot sleep. If I sleep, I may never wake." It was not poetry. It was fear. A fear so raw and unadorned that even her most devoted servants did not know how to endure witnessing it. The poison had left her bones hollow. The infections had left her organs failing. The grief had left her soul tired beyond repair. And now, in the quiet hours of the night, Elizabeth the Queen became Elizabeth the woman, old, afraid, and alone. This was not the death of a golden monarch. It was the unravelling of a survivor, done in the same silence in which she had suffered for decades. No more silks. No more painted porcelain skin. No more carefully choreographed distances. Just an aged woman slipping out of her story, rocked by the terror that she would fall asleep this time, for the last time. The mask was gone, and for the first time in half a century, there was no performance left. Only breath, only pain, and soon not even that. On March 24th, 1603, sometime in the quiet hours before dawn, the body of Queen Elizabeth finally yielded. No one could say precisely when it happened. No proclamation was made at the moment breath ceased. Even in death, she remained elusive, slipping away not with a gasp, but with a slow exhale that folded into silence. And yet, the performance did not end. Almost immediately, her body was taken into custody by royal embalmers, as if the rituals of monarchy required one final act of illusion. The task should have been routine. It was customary for monarchs' bodies to be preserved for several weeks, lying in state so the people might mourn. But when the shroud was drawn back, and her attendants saw what remained of her, an unravelling far more advanced than expected, they realized the truth. The Queen had begun to rot from the inside long before she died. Her skin, saturated for decades with white lead, was fragile as fine parchment. The ulcerations had never healed. The toxins had eaten through layers of tissue. As the embalmers worked, they discovered that her flesh tore at the slightest touch, and that her organs, overwhelmed by years of infections and fever, had already begun to decompose. An official present later wrote that the Queen's body emitted an odour most foul, despite fresh herbs and incense burning constantly in the room. The embalmer described her as difficult to handle, and though he said no more, the implication was clear. Death had only revealed the extent of what she had been forced to hide, and so they did what they had always done. They covered it up. Her face was coated once more with ceruse, the same white lead paste that had destroyed her. Her hands, too. The embalmers brushed layer after layer of the poison onto her cheeks until they smoothed into perfect stillness. Her missing teeth were masked with wax, shaping her jaw into a soft serenity. Her sparse hair was replaced with a golden wig, curled and crowned. The corpse of Elizabeth Tudor became a doll, a gilded effigy of her former self. Every sign of suffering was veiled beneath fabric, polish, and pigment. She was placed in an open coffin of glass, dressed in state robes, orb in hand, an image of calm majesty. To the thousands who filed past her at Whitehall and Westminster, she was not a fallen woman of flesh and despair. She was the Virgin Queen, serene even in death. And then 3 weeks after her passing, she was buried in Westminster Abbey. Her resting place? A marble tomb shared with Mary Tudor, the half-sister who once imprisoned her. A cruel or poetic symmetry, depending on how one sees it. The inscription praises their greatness and unity. Partners both in throne and grave, here we sleep. But nothing is said of what Elizabeth endured in private. In stone and legend, she remains the Queen of Victory, the woman who defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, ushered in the English Renaissance, and ruled for 44 years with fiery intelligence and unparalleled resolve. Her writings, her speeches, her portraits, they echo the myth. She is Gloriana Astrea, the Sun Queen. But the truth, the raw human truth, was buried with her. It would take centuries before private letters began to surface, before scholars examined personal diaries of attendants, before medical and forensic historians pieced together the clinical horror behind her decline. Not until the 20th century did the world begin to understand that the sovereign whose reign defined an age died slowly, painfully, poisoned by her own image, isolated by her own legend. Elizabeth's legacy is still breathtaking, a golden age of power, culture, naval dominance, and identity. But beneath the glowing surface lies the more tragic human legacy, a woman whose body decayed under layers of lead and silk, a queen whose mind shattered under pressure and poison, a legend who could not stop performing even for death. In the end, the most haunting image of Elizabeth is not the triumphant monarch of her portraits, but the quiet figure, alone, beneath the crown that could not save her from herself. That is her final legacy, glorious, terrible, and profoundly human. Elizabeth's death did not simply end a life, it extinguished an entire epoch of English history. On March 24th, 1603, when she breathed her last, the Tudor sunset, the age of Elizabeth, the Golden Age, was over. Her death triggered a meticulously orchestrated transition. By dawn, James VI of Scotland had been proclaimed James I of England, and with that act, the kingdoms of England and Scotland were united under one crown for the first time. The Tudor dynasty ended, and the House of Stuart began. It was a moment of political calculation that Elizabeth herself had long avoided out of caution, cunning, or the fear of being replaced while still alive. Her funeral, held on April 28th, 1603, was a spectacle of mourning and majesty. Thousands lined the streets of London as a coffin draped in velvet, and gold was carried to Westminster Abbey, led by the royal guard, followed by bishops, courtiers, nobles, and weeping commoners. To them, she was still Gloriana, the Virgin Queen who defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, upheld Protestant stability, and presided over the flowering of English culture through figures like William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe. But behind the public image of serene beauty and death lay an untold reality, one so shocking it would not reach public consciousness for centuries. Only a select few embalmers, ladies-in-waiting, physicians knew the truth. They had seen the grey, ulcerated skin, the disfigured mouth, the rotting odour of chronic infection. They knew that what lay in the funeral glass was an artifice, every bit as manufactured as her painted portraits in life. And under orders, they concealed it. They covered the decay beneath white lead ceruse, stuffed the cheeks with wax, arranged wigs over thinning hair, and fixed her features into a peaceful repose. For the people of England, Elizabeth was not allowed to be mortal, not even in death. The rhetoric of the time protected her myth. Bishops preached of divine providence. Poets praised her radiant majesty. Writers compared her to Estrella, the goddess of justice returned to heaven. As one eulogy stated, "Here lies she who was England." Nowhere did they speak of the poison, the pain, the psychological unravelling. The broken body stayed hidden behind the tomb, just as the lived suffering had been hidden behind cosmetics and ceremony. It was not until the 19th and 20th centuries, when historians and medical researchers began passing through letters, private diaries, and Tudor medical texts, that the true picture emerged. The story in shadows became visible. The Queen of England, the most powerful woman in Europe, was slowly destroyed by toxic beauty standards, chronic infection, and a relentless demand for perfection. Yet even now, that truth complicates her legacy rather than diminishes it. Because despite the disfigurement, the isolation, the nightmares, she never abdicated, never stopped ruling. Through septic fevers, through fractured sleep, through the terror of never removing the mask, she remained the embodiment of monarchy. She signed decrees. She negotiated with courtiers. She received ambassadors who later marveled at her composure, even as her body must have cried with pain below the velvet. In those final years, her silence was not weakness, but a terrible strength. A strength that resonates differently today. On the surface, Elizabeth's story is a cautionary tale about the lethal cost of beauty standards, the brutality of image-making, the silent suffering of women who are told they must remain ageless to remain valuable. But beneath that, it is something else, a testament to endurance. Not endurance of a fairy tale queen, but of a flawed, aging, frightened human being who held the weight of a nation on her decaying shoulders and refused to let that nation see her break. And so, when we speak of the Virgin Queen today, the myth and the woman are inseparable. An icon who built her world in gold and paid for it in poison, silence, and bone-deep solitude. Her life is an anthem and a warning. And her death remains 4 centuries later, a quiet, haunted whisper from behind the mask. This is the price of perfection. From a modern vantage point, the story of Elizabeth is no longer just the tragedy of a single monarch. It becomes a haunting metaphor for the violence of beauty standards, a study in how power and appearance become indistinguishable in a woman's life. Elizabeth was not merely a victim of lead-based cosmetics. She was a victim of an entire ideology that told her, to be worthy, you must be beautiful. To remain powerful, you must appear ageless. It was not the ceruse that poisoned her first, it was the belief that her worth depended on it. In a world where feminine authority was an anomaly and a threat, Elizabeth crafted a persona of eternal maidenhood, a virgin queen, untouched by time, unmarred by childbirth, immune to the decay that claimed ordinary women. That appearance was not vanity, it was political currency. Every smooth cheek in a state portrait assured foreign courts, domestic rivals, and even her own troops that she was still sovereign, still divine, still chosen by God. These images, painted with costly pigments and idealized flourishes, were propaganda as potent as any treaty or army. But every mask exacts a price. Once the mythology was built, it owned her. Elizabeth could not stop painting herself white, not because she loved it, but because without it, she feared the collapse of her entire world. Think of it. Had she stepped out without that mask of youth, she risked losing not just admiration but compliance, obedience, allegiance. A wrinkled queen was a vulnerable one. In a kingdom where kings ruled by divine right, a woman who looked mortal risked being treated as replaceable. That was the trap. Her physicians knew, or at least suspected, that the ceruse and vermilion contributed to her deterioration. Some urged caution. Yet none insisted, not only because they feared her wrath, but because her beauty was not her own. It was a national requirement, a political expectation. In one sense, no one forced Elizabeth to swallow poison, but in truth, everyone did. Through expectation, through tradition, through the same pressure we still see today. That a woman's credibility, competence, even her right to take up space depends on visual perfection. Today, we no longer smear lead and mercury across our faces. We inject fillers, undergo laser resurfacing, pour money into filters, cosmetics, surgeries, anti-aging regimens. But the code is the same. Elizabeth's story reveals the cost of living inside a myth. She built a legend of invincible beauty and became its first casualty. Her self-determination became a prison cell. Her quest to appear untarnished meant she could never rest. Never be sick. Never be old. Never be human in public. This is what makes her tragedy strangely timeless. The addiction was not to makeup, it was to approval, to the applause that stalks every powerful woman, to the unspoken rule: beautiful and ageless, or be forgotten. Consider her final days, when attendants saw her unpainted face for the first time in decades, and recoiled not from her appearance, but from the revelation that even queens can fall apart. Does that not mirror the way our society treats visible aging today? And is our distance from Elizabeth's suffering really so great? Or have we simply learned to accept the same dynamics wearing more modern clothes? If Elizabeth were alive now, queen of a country that still obsesses over image, bodies and age, would she escape the trap? Or would she be trapped by a different set of cosmetics? Digital filters, headlines, viral photos, paparazzi lenses that magnify every crease? Perhaps it is easier to ask, how many modern Elizabeths live among us polished, poised, powerful on the outside, and privately crumbling under the cost of flawless performance? The poison may not be lead anymore, but the mirror still whispers, "You must not change," and many women, like Elizabeth, still whisper back, "Then let me die instead." In the closing chapters of Elizabeth's story, an unsettling truth begins to glimmer through the decay and the grandeur. This was not merely the downfall of a queen, it was the death spiral of an identity. Elizabeth Tudor was not undone solely by poison or infection. She was undone by the unbearable weight of a legend. She herself had built a legend so luminous that she could no longer step outside of it without shattering everything. She became, in her final years, something like a living corpse of authority, moving through polished chambers and political decisions the way a ghost haunts a house it once owned. Each day, she constructed her survival in 3 layers. Paint, thick enough to obscure wounds, swelling, decay; silk, draped heavily enough to hide the shaking and the sores; sovereignty, wielded fiercely enough to drown out the silence between her and her own body. Her pain was not passive. Every tremor, every breath through reeking teeth, every sleepless night of hallucination was the cost of a merciless performance. And beneath that performance lay the 2 unspoken truths that shaped her downfall. First, she could not admit she was mortal. She fought time with the desperation of someone who believed that aging and the vulnerability it revealed was synonymous with weakness, with death, with political irrelevance. Second, she was trapped inside a role that billions would later envy: the untouchable ruler, the virgin messiah, the goddess in silk and lead. And when a role becomes holy, it also becomes a prison. Elizabeth could not stop performing because without the performance, the world might stop believing. And without belief, where would the queen be? It was not ambition that destroyed Elizabeth. It was the refusal to ever step off the stage. And so the tragedy deepened. The longer she denied the erosion of her body, the more violently that body revolted. The more she denied the shattering of her mind, the more her mind dissolved into nightmares. And when she could no longer sustain the charade in life, the world refused to let her rest. She died, yet even then, there was no release. Her corpse was painted back into her myth. Her rotting flesh, paper-thin and laced with lesions, was slathered once more in lead. Her collapsed cheeks were inflated with wax. Her thinning scalp was reimagined with golden curls. She was not allowed to be human even in death. No one afforded her the dignity of decay. The idol had to live on, and living idols must hide their flaws. One cannot look upon that truth and not feel the chilling echo in our own world. Elizabeth's suffering is not ancient history. It is a mirror held up to modern life. We too anoint images sacred. We perfect ourselves for screens. We calibrate persona for admiration. We diet and inject and filter. We chase the shimmering promise that if we perform flawlessly, if we crush our own humanity beneath the matching weight of paint, silk, and curated sovereignty, we will be loved. Respected, seen, safe. But what if, like Elizabeth, we are killing the self to keep the image alive? Her story poses a question with no gentle answer. What happens to the soul when it is forced to remain flawless for too long? It dies first. Elizabeth's heart likely stopped on March 24th, 1603. But her sense of self, her spirit, her inner voice had been suffocated for decades. Smothered beneath the mask she could no longer remove without losing everything. She is, in the end, a warning. To every person, especially every woman, who feels their worth hinges on performance. Be careful what you perfect, because to keep that perfection intact, you may one day wake up and realize you died long before your body did, and the world is still applauding the mask. What chills the blood most in Elizabeth's story is not the poison itself, it is the silence that surrounded it. For decades, she was dying in plain sight, and yet the world around her said nothing. Her ladies-in-waiting wiped away blood from her pillowcases. Her physicians dabbed mercury on her wounds. Her painters smoothed out every crack and lesion in their official portraits. Foreign ambassadors spoke of her brilliance, but whispered quietly of her rotting teeth and trembling hands. But none of them dared break the silence, because everyone was invested in keeping the myth alive. Elizabeth was not only queen, she was a symbol, the beating heart of England's stability, prosperity, and national identity. From the day she claimed the throne in 1558 to her death in 1603, a reign lasting 4 decades and 5 years, she embodied the idea of England itself. Radiant, eternal, victorious. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana, a living talisman of power. To admit that this icon was human, fragile, dying was unthinkable. Thus, a collective silence descended, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Fear that the truth of her decay would unravel the nation's faith in her. Fear that admitting weakness would invite rebellion, invasion, chaos. In a very real sense, everyone from the lowliest scullery maid to the cunning court advisor needed Elizabeth to stay beautiful. And so a double reality was carefully engineered. In one world, the public's world, Elizabeth stood radiant in jeweled gowns, waving from balconies, dazzling in state processions. She received foreign dignitaries with witty repartee. She danced, she proclaimed, she smiled, and the people cheered. In the other world, the hidden world, Elizabeth coughed up blood. She wore rags under her silks to soak up infection. She picked at lesions when nobody watched. She wept silently in her chambers, knowing that even death would not let her remove her mask. The two worlds never touched. There was a silent pact. Let the queen remain a dream, even as the woman collapses beneath it. This is the darkest truth of her story. Everyone helped kill her, not by poisoning her directly, but by refusing to let her stop poisoning herself. Every time a painter airbrushed a ruin into radiance, every time a minister glorified her in speeches while refusing to acknowledge her pain, every time a handmaiden pressed ceruse gently onto a wound that would never heal, they reinforced the message, better to die perfect than live imperfect. Her tragedy becomes symbolic, almost allegorical. She is the clearest example of what modern psychology calls ego splitting, the division between one's public self and private self. It is the unbearable chasm between who I am and who I must be in order to be loved. For Elizabeth, the split became total. The public saw Queen Elizabeth, the eternal flame, but in the shadows there stood a woman unmade the corpse of her own legend. She feared exposure more than death. For her, being seen without the mask even once would be worse than the grave. So she wore it every day, even when it burned her skin, even when it gnawed at her organs, even when it shattered her sleep and filled her world with ghosts. And here is the most frightening part. She is no antique phenomenon. Her life is the blueprint for millions today who live inside curated images on screens, in boardrooms, in relationships which they cannot step away from without collapsing the story people believe about them. People pleasers, influencers, leaders, mothers, strong friends. Behind every perfect smile may lie a private scream. Elizabeth Tudor stands as their silent, suffering ancestor, a woman applauded to death. A woman who learned too late that when you become a symbol, especially a flawless one, you must sacrifice your humanity on its altar. And what remains is not just the question, how did she die, but the far more haunting question, how many of us are dying the same way, only slower and more quietly?